The first time the German officer whispered the phrase, it was not meant to be clever or cruel. It was spoken quietly, almost reverently, in a concrete bunker that smelled of damp earth and burned cordite. "Devils in baggy pants," he muttered, staring at a map that no longer made sense. Only hours earlier, the night sky over Normandy had been calm, heavy with clouds and distant thunder. Then the darkness tore open. Engines droned overhead, low and relentless, and suddenly the air filled with falling men. Parachutes blossomed like pale flowers, drifting silently toward fields, hedgerows, flooded pastures, and narrow farm roads. For the Germans watching from below, it felt less like an invasion and more like a curse descending from the heavens. The American paratroopers did not land cleanly. They never expected to. Winds scattered them, flak shattered formations, and tracer fire stitched the sky with red lines. Some men splashed into flooded fields and drowned beneath the weight of their gear. Others slammed into trees, breaking bones before the fight even began. Yet those who survived moved fast, their uniforms hung loose, trousers wide and stuffed with ammunition, grenades and medical kits. Their jackets bulged with tools meant for destruction. To German sentries peering into the night, these figures did not resemble disciplined infantry advancing in ranks. They appeared suddenly, out of nowhere, baggy silhouettes slipping between shadows, striking and disappearing again. The night itself seemed to betray the defenders. Paratroopers fired from hedgerows, barns and ditches, often alone or in pairs, yet sounding like entire platoons. A machine gun would open up from one direction, only to fall silent as rifles cracked from another. German field phones went dead as wires were cut by men who had memorized their targets weeks before. Road signs vanished. Officers sent runners who never returned. Orders issued at midnight were meaningless by dawn. The Americans did not need to capture ground yet. Their mission was confusion, and they executed it perfectly. Fear spread faster than gunfire. German soldiers whispered that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. One checkpoint reported attackers in front, another swore they were behind the lines, and a third insisted paratroopers were already wearing German uniforms. None of it was entirely true, yet all of it felt real in the chaos of darkness. The loose trousers, flapping as the Americans ran, became etched into memory. Those pants, practical and unremarkable in daylight, took on something monstrous at night. They made the men look larger, distorted, unreal, as if they were not bound by the same rules of war. A young German lieutenant crouched in a foxhole and watched one of them sprint across an open field under fire, bullets snapping past, never slowing. Another paratrooper followed, then another, shouting orders that echoed through the hedgerows. The lieutenant counted at least 20 voices, though there could not have been more than 5 men. Still, his hands shook as he chambered another round. Training told him to hold position. Instinct screamed that holding position meant death. Somewhere nearby, an American laughed, sharp and fearless, the sound carrying through the night like an insult to reason. The paratroopers fought as if being surrounded meant nothing. Cut off from their units, unsure of their exact location, they attacked anyway. They ambushed convoys, seized bridges with handfuls of men, and overran gun crews who never saw them coming. Each small victory multiplied the fear. Reports sent to headquarters grew more frantic, filled with contradictions and underlined warnings. The enemy was not advancing in a line. The enemy was erupting from the ground itself. German officers struggled to understand how so few men could create such devastation in such a short time. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion gnawed at the defenders. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves suggested an approaching devil. Every shadow might hide a man with a knife. The Americans exploited this mercilessly, firing sporadically, then going silent, then striking again somewhere else. They knew the night favored them. Their training had prepared them for isolation, for operating without orders, for improvisation. To the Germans, this lack of visible structure felt terrifying. It was easier to fight an army you could see than one that dissolved into the dark. In a farmhouse near a crossroads, a German captain gathered his men and tried to restore order. Maps were spread across a wooden table, candles flickering as artillery rumbled in the distance. Before he could issue new instructions, shots shattered the windows. Grenades exploded in the yard. Shouts erupted from multiple directions. The captain fell before he could draw his pistol. When the firing stopped, the Americans were already gone, leaving only bodies and questions behind. By morning, the crossroads was unusable, clogged with wreckage and fear. The nickname spread quickly, passed from unit to unit like a warning. Devils in baggy pants. It captured something no official report could explain. These were not faceless soldiers advancing behind tanks. These were men who dropped into the unknown, embraced chaos, and turned it into a weapon. Their loose uniforms became a symbol of that madness, a visual reminder that conventional defenses meant little against an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. As dawn crept closer, the Germans realized the night had cost them more than casualties. It had shattered their sense of control. Positions that were secure at sunset were compromised by sunrise. Communications were unreliable. Commanders doubted their own information. And somewhere in the fading darkness, the paratroopers regrouped, dirty, wounded, and low on ammunition, yet grinning as they linked up with one another. They had done exactly what they were meant to do. When the sun finally rose over Normandy, it revealed a battlefield already tilted against the defenders. The main invasion was coming, and the groundwork had been laid by men who fell from the sky in the dead of night. For the German officers who survived those first hours, the phrase remained etched in memory. Devils in baggy pants was not an insult, it was an admission. An acknowledgement that what they had faced was something beyond ordinary soldiers. Something that thrived in darkness, fed on confusion, and struck with terrifying precision. And as the day unfolded and the full scale of the invasion became clear, many of them understood a grim truth. If this was only the beginning, then the war had just entered a far more dangerous chapter. As the night stretched on, and the first pale hints of dawn threatened the horizon, German command posts drowned in uncertainty. Telephones rang endlessly, maps were redrawn and crossed out, and officers argued over reports that contradicted each other, line by line. One unit swore American paratroopers were massing for an attack near a bridge, another claimed the bridge had already fallen hours ago, and a third insisted the enemy had vanished completely. None of them could explain how a force that had arrived so scattered could now feel so overwhelmingly present. The confusion did not come from numbers alone, but from the way the Americans moved, fought, and vanished before patterns could form. Small groups of paratroopers gathered wherever fate had dropped them. Rank mattered less than initiative. Whoever knew the terrain best led, whoever had ammunition shared it, whoever could still walk kept moving. They stole bicycles from barns, flipped road signs, and dragged fallen German helmets onto fence posts to suggest ambushes where none existed. A single flare fired into the sky could freeze an entire German platoon, convinced it signaled a larger attack. The Americans understood fear instinctively, and they cultivated it with ruthless creativity. German patrols, sent to clear villages, often returned, bloodied and shaken, if they returned at all. A squad might advance cautiously down a hedgerow-lined lane, only for gunfire to erupt from behind, then ahead, then somewhere impossible to pinpoint. Paratroopers fired a few shots and relocated, using the thick Norman countryside like a living maze. The baggy trousers, loose and practical, brushed against leaves and mud, allowing quick movement without the stiff, rigid look of German field uniforms. In fleeting glimpses, those wide silhouettes seemed inhuman, exaggerated by adrenaline and terror. One German sergeant later recalled seeing an American paratrooper rise from a ditch like a phantom, face smeared with dirt, eyes wild, weapon already firing. The sergeant swore the man looked amused, as if the chaos delighted him. Whether that was true or not no longer mattered. The image spread, repeated in different forms by different witnesses, each retelling sharpening the edge of the myth. Soon, every American paratrooper was imagined as fearless, laughing, unstoppable. The German High Command struggled to reassert control, ordering counterattacks that stalled almost immediately. Units marched toward objectives that no longer existed or walked straight into ambushes set by a handful of men. Even when Germans outnumbered their attackers, hesitation crept in. The night had taught them that superiority on paper meant little if the enemy dictated when and where to fight. Every hedgerow became suspect. Every farmhouse seemed hostile. The countryside itself felt occupied. Meanwhile, the paratroopers pressed their advantage, not through brute force, but through nerve. They attacked artillery crews, spiking guns and melting away before reinforcements arrived. They seized bridges, not by overwhelming them, but by appearing in places the defenders thought impossible. A German officer defending one such bridge later wrote that he never saw the Americans approach. One moment, the road was empty. The next, gunfire came from both banks, and grenades rolled between his men's boots. When it was over, fewer than 10 Americans held the crossing, yet it felt as though an entire battalion had struck. By mid-morning, exhaustion hollowed the German defenders. They had been awake all night, nerves shredded, constantly expecting another sudden attack. Orders from higher command urged them to hold, to regroup, to wait for armored support. But waiting was agony. Silence became as frightening as gunfire. Every quiet minute allowed imagination to fill the gaps, conjuring more devils slipping through the fields. German officers began to notice a pattern, though they struggled to articulate it. The Americans did not seek decisive engagements yet. They avoided prolonged firefights unless necessary. Their goal was disruption, delay, and psychological collapse. They forced German units to react rather than act, to defend rather than maneuver. In doing so, they stole time, the most precious commodity of the invasion's opening hours. The nickname followed this realization, "Devils in Baggy Pants." It appeared in hurried notes, half-joking comments, and bitter mutterings between officers. The phrase captured the sense that these men were not bound by conventional logic. They did not retreat when cut off. They did not freeze when outnumbered. They attacked supply columns with reckless confidence, knowing that even if they died, the confusion they created would ripple outward. As daylight strengthened, American paratroopers began linking up in larger numbers. Isolated skirmishes merged into coordinated actions. Roads, once controlled by German units, fell under American fire. Signals flares marked positions not for retreat, but for consolidation. The same men who had seemed like scattered raiders at night now formed defensive perimeters, prepared to hold against counterattacks. To German commanders, this transition felt almost mocking. The devils who had haunted the darkness were now solidifying into something far more dangerous. A German major overseeing a hastily organized counterattack watched his men advance toward a hedgerow where American fire had been reported. Before they reached it, gunfire erupted from their flank, then from behind. Then, from the hedgerow itself, the major survived barely, but later admitted he never understood how the Americans moved so quickly. He had assumed they were exhausted, low on ammunition, and vulnerable. Instead, they seemed energized by the fight, feeding off the very chaos they created. The psychological toll deepened. German soldiers hesitated before advancing, scanning shadows that now offered no protection in daylight. The memory of the night lingered, shaping every decision. Officers shouted to maintain discipline, but discipline strained under constant uncertainty. Even victories felt hollow, achieved at a cost far higher than expected. By afternoon, reports confirmed what many had already suspected. The airborne landings had succeeded beyond their immediate tactical goals. They had fractured German defenses, delayed reinforcements, and sown fear deep behind the lines. The baggy pants were no longer just a visual oddity. They were a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that valued initiative over order, speed over certainty. American paratroopers dug in, tending wounds, redistributing ammunition, and preparing for the inevitable counterblows. Many were exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken by the violence of the night, yet morale remained high. They joked darkly, shared cigarettes, and spoke with grim satisfaction about objectives achieved against impossible odds. They knew the Germans feared them now, and that knowledge mattered. German officers, reviewing the day's losses, could not escape the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The enemy they faced was not simply better equipped or numerically superior. He was psychologically unbound, willing to embrace disorder as a weapon. The devils in baggy pants had rewritten the rules of engagement before the main invasion forces even reached the beaches. As evening approached once more, the Germans braced themselves. They fortified positions, posted extra sentries, and issued strict orders against panic. Yet beneath the preparation lay a quiet dread. The night would come again, and with it, perhaps, the return of those men who had fallen from the sky and turned certainty into fear. By the second night, the Germans understood that what they faced was no passing shock, but a transformation of the battlefield itself. The first darkness had brought confusion, the second brought certainty of a grim kind. These men were still there. Somewhere in the hedgerows, in the orchards, in the ruined farmyards, the American paratroopers remained, bruised and bloodied, yet unbroken. They had not vanished with daylight, as some hoped. Instead, they waited, watched, and prepared, turning every hour into borrowed time stolen from German plans. German units attempted counterattacks with renewed determination. Armor rolled forward cautiously, infantry following in tight formations meant to discourage ambush. But the countryside refused to cooperate. Roads narrowed between earthen walls thick with roots and foliage. Tanks became clumsy beasts, blind to threats lurking just beyond their steel hulls. Paratroopers struck where armor could not easily respond, targeting lead vehicles, cutting off columns, and forcing entire formations to halt. Each delay rippled outward, disrupting timetables that had already been strained beyond recovery. American paratroopers no longer fought purely as scattered raiders. Groups consolidated into ad hoc companies, formed not by doctrine but by necessity. A lieutenant who had landed miles from his intended drop zone now commanded men from 3 different units. A sergeant took charge of an objective he had never seen on a map. Authority flowed naturally to those who acted, who moved first, who refused to wait. To German officers observing from a distance, this fluid leadership seemed reckless, yet it produced results that rigid structures could not counter quickly enough. As word spread through German ranks, the nickname took on a heavier meaning. Devils in baggy pants was no longer just a description of appearance or behavior. It became shorthand for unpredictability itself. Soldiers spoke it quietly, as if naming the enemy too loudly might summon them. The phrase crept into after-action reports and private letters, capturing something official language could not. These Americans were not fighting the war Germany had prepared for. German morale frayed as losses mounted in unexpected places. Supply convoys vanished along supposedly secure routes. Artillery positions fell silent one by one, crews killed or driven off by sudden assaults. Each loss forced commanders to divert troops to guard duties, thinning the lines where strength was most needed. The paratroopers achieved with handfuls of men what entire divisions struggled to do through conventional means. They forced Germany to fight shadows. For the Americans, fatigue pressed hard. Many had not slept properly since the jump. Ammunition ran low, water was scarce, and wounds festered beneath hastily applied bandages. Yet they held. They knew relief was coming from the beaches, that their suffering had purpose. Each hour they delayed German movement meant another foothold secured for the invasion. That knowledge hardened them against fear. In a shattered village near a crossroads, a group of paratroopers repelled repeated German probes. Mortar rounds pounded the outskirts, and machine gun fire chewed through stone walls. Still the Americans held, shifting positions, conserving ammunition, refusing to yield. A German officer observing through binoculars reportedly shook his head in disbelief. He had expected these men to break, to retreat under pressure. Instead, they adapted, responding with calm aggression that defied his expectations. As dusk fell again, the battlefield grew eerily quiet. Smoke hung low over the fields. The dead lay where they had fallen, German and American alike, mute witnesses to a fight that had already altered history. German commanders gathered their remaining strength, planning a decisive effort to crush the airborne threat before it could link fully with seaborne forces. Yet beneath the planning lay resignation. Too much time had been lost. Too many opportunities had slipped away. The night returned, but it no longer belonged solely to the Americans. German troops were ready this time, fingers tight on triggers, eyes scanning relentlessly. And yet, when the first shots rang out, panic flared anew. The paratroopers attacked selectively, surgically, choosing moments that maximized confusion. A sudden burst of fire here, an explosion there, then silence. The defenders fired into darkness, unsure if they were hitting anything at all. By morning, the reality could no longer be denied. The airborne landings had succeeded beyond their intended scope. German defenses behind the beaches were fractured, disoriented, and exhausted. The main invasion forces pushed inland against resistance that should have been far stronger. The devils in baggy pants had done their work. In the days that followed, as front lines stabilized and the chaos of the initial landings faded, German officers reflected grimly on what they had witnessed. They wrote of courage, of fear, of an enemy who refused to behave as expected. Many acknowledged, privately if not publicly, that the Americans' greatest weapon had been psychological. By embracing disorder, they had imposed it on everyone else. For the paratroopers who survived, the nickname became a point of pride. They wore it with a crooked smile, knowing what it had cost. They remembered the men who had fallen into flooded fields and never risen, the friends lost in the dark, the moments when courage was the only thing keeping them moving. The baggy pants were just cloth, but what filled them were men willing to step into uncertainty and make it their own. Long after the war, historians would analyze tactics, logistics, and strategy, measuring success in miles gained and divisions destroyed. Yet those who were there remembered something simpler and more human. They remembered a night when fear ruled, when shadows walked, and when a handful of men changed the course of a battle by refusing to be predictable. That is why German officers called them devils in baggy pants, not because of their uniforms or their numbers or even their weapons, but because in the darkest hours, when control mattered most, these men fell from the sky and proved that chaos, wielded with courage, could break even the strongest defenses. And once that lesson was learned, it could never be forgotten.